AskReddit. What is the creepiest thing that's happened to you personally that made you question reality? I was camping with my family on summer break when I was a kid. The first night we heard some rustling off in the distance, so my dad went to go check it out. He came back and said he found an old dirty sleeping bag with a bunch of trash around it. I took this as him implying that it could have been a camp that got ransacked by a curious bear. We'd hear movement in the tree line for the next couple nights, and it scared the shit out of me. The last night we were there, I had a nightmare that a bear had made it into my tent and was licking and biting my feet. I woke up from the dream and shined my watch light into the dirt-covered wrinkly face of an elderly man. He was sucking on my toes, and he immediately exited my tent and took off right after we made eye contact. I still don't know if it was my imagination or not all these years later. I never told anyone, and I have nightmares about it. I am at in our college's anatomy class, which takes place in the cadaver lab. Dead bodies. Late one night, I am working alone in the cadaver lab and I start to hear a noise. It's hard to tell what the noise sounds like, but it's a consistent muffled noise. So I kind of walk around the room and locate it. Now normally the bodies are all kept in these big metal crates, but at the time we had one more body than we did crate. So one body was in a plastic body bag and that's where the noise was coming from. So I am terrified at this point, all alone in the lab, looking down at this plastic body bag that I can see the outline of the body that presumably is coming back to life because it is definitely making noise. I stood over this body for a solid minute, debating whether I should open the bag, and finally the noise just stops. I got all my stuff together and bolted from the lab. A couple weeks later, the professor tells me to be careful if I ever work on that body because there is a live pacemaker in it, so don't cut into that, and it will vibrate and ring every few hours if it's low on battery. I let out the biggest sigh of relief that we weren't haunted. So, I'm a die-hard atheist, but I can't fully explain this one. I have a big family, like really big. Last count, I had around 20 cousins. One day we were all hanging out in the family farm and decided to spend the night. We just did girls in a room and boys in another, and everything was going fine. It was around 4 in the morning when I woke up to one of my cousins standing by the door. The hallway light was on and shining on my face, so I could only see his outline, but I knew it was Josh. I asked him what was he doing and if he needed something, but he didn't move, and my eyes were starting to adjust. I could see more details, but I couldn't see his face. I was really sleepy and confused when the hallway light, Josh's shape, everything disappeared. It was just darkness and an open door. I knew I was awake because I was sitting down. I decided to get one of my roommate cousins up and go check on the boys. Josh had an allergy to something. He didn't want it to bother anyone, so he took a Benadryl and went to bed. When I checked on him, he wasn't breathing. We got my uncle up. He gave Josh some heavy duty medication, and we took him to a hospital. Everyone was fine. Josh told me he knew I was insomniac, and while he was suffocating, unable to make a noise, he kept praying I couldn't sleep, and decided to check on him. Talking with my son when he was 3 or 4 years old while he was playing with a Darth Vader toy in his mom's lap. Talking about the Wiggles or Barney or whatever, completely unprompted. He said nonchalantly, "Dingo cold. Dingo cold," and goes back to playing with his Star Wars toys. I asked him what he said and he denied saying anything with a giggle. My wife very clearly heard him say dingo cold too. I never told him about my childhood best friend, Dingo, being killed in an avalanche 10 years earlier. It was years ago, when I was about 17. I had gotten home from school and wasn't feeling well, so I spent the rest of the day just laying on the couch. By about 8 p.m. I was feeling even worse and decided I should just try to sleep whatever it is off, so I go to my room and get in bed and pass out pretty quickly. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I suddenly woke up in my pitch black bedroom and all I could think was I'm going to die right now. My body was so weak, the room was spinning and my body felt like it was on fire. I look over to the edge of my bed and sitting on the edge is my grandmother, who died just a few months ago. She pats my arm and says it's going to be okay. Just call for your dad. Try it. Call for your dad. So I start calling for him and it felt like an eternity, but he finally burst through my door and asks what's wrong. I look over and my grandmother is gone. After that, he gets me up and takes me to the ER where I have a fever of 106F, which explains a lot. I had to get a ton of fluids and a shot in my hip, but I eventually felt okay-ish. Her being there felt so real. It was so weird. I know logically she wasn't, but it felt so real. That sort of messed with me a little. I loved her dearly and her death was very sudden. We kept her ashes in a nice urn in the house under a painting she had done herself. When I got home and passed by, I said thanks to her. I know it was the fever melting my brain and maybe some sleep paralysis, but it still made me question the afterlife and those sorts of things. Not me, but my grandfather. My grandfather had been in World War II and told us about when himself and a few other soldiers had been separated from his unit and were trying to get to Normandy. They had gone through a clearing in a wooded area but had to drop when they heard something approaching. They were on their bellies in low grass when they saw 20 or 30 German soldiers running across the clearing, clearly in a state of panic. Then they just froze in mid-step. He said they resembled statues and that some weren't even touching the ground. And that there was no noise whatsoever, even the birds had gone silent. After a few seconds came a loud noise like metal scraping on concrete, and the frozen soldiers started to become blurry to the point at which they vanished without a trace. This had been reported by all of the soldiers that were present, and all were called to the War Office London after their return to the UK, where they were pressed on what they saw over the period of a few days, and were taken back to the same spot in France shortly after the war had ended. Surprisingly, when they got there were other men sharing the same accommodation who reported similar occurrences in the exact same area. They were all taken to the woods and had to describe where and how the events took place. My granddad had said that the entire area was guarded heavily and that part of the ground was heavily excavated. The strangest thing of all, the other he said, was that there were hundreds of dogs in the area, just milling around for no apparent reason. They returned to the UK with a gag order ordering them never to speak about any of this. He went back to the same spot in France before he died in 1985 and said that the area had been covered with unmarked warehouses and was guarded by an unusually professional security company. He reckoned they were military. I've tried to find out more about this but can't find any records of it, but I do remember one of the guys who he was with the day he used to come and visit sometimes and referred to the place as the Splintered Woods. I once took a nap at my boyfriend's house and fell into a deep sleep. His best friend died 2 years ago. We'll call him Jay, and I never got the chance to meet him. I only know stories that my boyfriend tells me. I began dreaming. I dreamt I woke up from my nap and walked around the house to find my boyfriend. I kept running into people I know, and each time I would say, "I am sleeping right now. I need to wake up." For about 2 hours, I walked around trying to convince everyone this wasn't reality and that this was actually a dream. Then I met Jay. He was in the dream, but he wasn't. I could tell he was the only other real entity and everything else was part of the dream. I said, "Hello, I'm so and so." He said, "I know." And then I said, "So you're Jay?" And he nodded. At that moment we both knew we were meeting for the first time. We just looked at each other and knew. Then I woke up. I told my boyfriend, "I think I just met Jay," and described the dream. He then explained to me that Jay was really into lucid dreaming and would study it and try to train himself to lucid dream, or take acid shrooms and try to dream. The whole experience was really crazy, but I'm convinced I was in a different dimension and met his deceased best friend. When I was a kid between 8 or 9, I used to wake up every night to headlights coming through my bedroom window. The lights would stop and turn off, not as if a car drove by but as if they were turned off. Then the long shadows of a man, as if were looking through my window, would pass by and stop in front of my window. I would lay really still and pretend nothing happened, every night for months. Eventually I convinced myself it was imagination. Now that I think back, it stopped when my stepdad moved in. My mom was single, but I was convinced it wasn't real. Across the street lived my best friend whose mom was also single and she refused to sleep in her bedroom. Her window faced my window. She told me years later it was because every night a man would park in her side yard and walk over to my yard. The long shadows were from the light in her yard. She eventually decided it was my dad checking on us and never told me until I was a teenager. It wasn't my dad. I asked him. So I thought I was crazy and hallucinating for years, and perhaps I wasn't, or two kids were having odd dreams at the same time every night. I was playing with our dog in the living room. At the time I was around 9 years old. We were doing our usual only play like this when mom isn't home else she'll tell us to stop type of playing. So basically playing fetch in the living room. At one point I threw the toy, which caused it to ricochet out of the living room into the kitchen. Franz, our dog's name, chased it and disappeared around the corner to get it. At that exact moment the front door opened and mom walked in with Franz on a leash after a 2-hour walk over the beach and dunes. I tried to explain, but can't. I played with him for at least 15 minutes in. Apparently, my imagination. But I just don't believe that. When he's such a good boy he learns how to astral project to play with you while he's away. The best dogs are also wizards. I have 2 wireless mouses. One for a work laptop and one for my personal laptop. When I let things get messy, I usually just stack one laptop on top of the closed one underneath, with both mouses near the mouse pad. Okay, so I get a call from work saying I need to hop online. I open the work laptop and grab the mouse and start opening my work portal. I open email. I do my usual routine. Everything works fine. Then I realize that I'm using the mouse connected to my personal laptop on my work laptop. I shake the mouse. No response. It stopped working once I realized that it shouldn't be working. Ever since then, I've found it hard to believe that we don't live in some sort of a simulation.